Markus, hi.
Hi, nice to meet you, Ante.
It looks great. Very
Thanks a lot.
common uniform for Ukraine.
Yeah.
It's for me it's difficult to start the interview because I always want to ask Austrians why you are not with Ukraine now from the military point of view. But I understand there is a political reasons. Officially, your country is neutral, and there is a serious geopolitical background for these things. However, the Austrian militaries, I know that you have a lot of compassion to Ukrainians. You have personal friends, and I know some of them died, unfortunately, Ukrainian soldiers. So for you, for the military, how you can estimate the current situation, and what is the war of Russia against Ukraine for you as a military? How you perceive it?
Okay, so first of all, thanks a lot for the possibility to have this interview with you. Before I start, I would like to stress two things. First is that the Chancellor, the Austrian Chancellor, was quite clear when it comes to the fact on what side we are, because he said morally we are completely on the side of the West and we assist the Ukraine. And when you compare the size of the country and what we give to the Ukrainians, especially in the civilian field, we are, let's say, in the middle, more or less, of the European countries. The other side is, of course, that the Chancellor also said that military-wise we are neutral in a way. So that means we don't give to Ukraine a special military support. But of course, when it comes to transport and this kind of stuff, we are not resisting what is going on and what is delivered in direction of Ukraine in a way. So the second thing is, I had the chance to command a small unit of Ukrainian soldiers in Kosovo. And I would like to stress once again that you can be very proud of your soldiers. The experiences I made with them were very great. There were several officers. Unfortunately, two were killed already, one in Seversky Donetsk, the other one in Bakhmut. But I would like to give you a clear understanding that what I observed there in Kosovo before the war started again, because it started already in 2014 in Ukraine, was quite impressive. So you can be very proud of what they do.
Thank you.
So let's talk about the front lines.
Actually, thank you for your very sincere introduction, because I feel your compassion to our nation. And actually, first question concerning our interview: what happened? What has happened in front line, or what is war from your point of view? Because you have a lot of commenters in the TV, but what is your personal attitude to this situation as a military independent expert?
Yeah, so the thing is, we have to make sure that we have a clear and neutral understanding of what is going on the front lines. And what we have seen during the last months, and what is also more or less described very good, especially in this kind of RUSI reports, the Royal United Service Institute reports, there's already the fourth, which was published just recently, is that the Russians are obviously able to adapt to the situation. It was a shock for them when they actually, especially in the beginning, found out that it was not going like they have planned, and they were completely surprised by the very stiff resistance of the Ukrainian side, but they were able to adapt. So Ukraine was able to manage 3 times to gain back territory. That was at Kiev, that was at Kharkiv, and it was at Kherson. But the situation is that in October, November last year, the Russians decided somehow to hold a certain line. And this line is this 1,200 kilometer front line, starting from the south in Kherson, going up to more or less the Kupiansk region in a way. And that was also the time when the Russians started to conduct a strategic air campaign against Ukraine. And a lot of people don't understand, because they think the Russian Air Force is not active, which is not true. But what they do is they are using their strategic asset, let's say, for example, these Tu-59 Bears and Tu-160 and so on, and firing cruise missiles from Belarusian airspace or even Ukraine, or using their Black Sea ships more or less to fire cruise missiles into Ukraine. And this, of course, has a attritional effect on Ukraine. So Ukraine has 2 things to consider. The first is on the strategic level, the strategic air campaign against Ukraine in the depths of the country. And the other thing is what is going on the front lines. So what we have seen is that during the winter time, the Russians tried at special places like Ugledar, Avdiivka and somewhere else to go again into the offensive with the aim to, in their view, liberate Donetsk, to occupy Donetsk in a way. But they haven't managed. Why? Because the Ukrainians also used, especially the autumn, to prepare themselves to defend more or less along the front line. So whenever the Russians started to attack, they were actually trapped in minefields, anti-tank weapon positions, and so on and so on. What the situation was after Kherson is that the Russians reorganized, and with the help of the 30,000 troops which they were able to withdraw from the Kherson region, which they actually used in Bakhmut, they put a lot of pressure in Donbass on the Ukrainian forces. So the Ukrainians had to come up with more reserves, and so the fight raged in between them, especially in the Bakhmut area. And the situation is at the moment that Ukraine was able to consolidate along this line, and the question is now what will happen next. I would say the good thing is...
Yes, wait, what happened next is a very complicated thing. I want to summarize. So did you understand, did I understand correctly that the level on the scale of resistance of Ukrainians was anticipated for Russians, but during this 1 year of war, they learned from their mistakes?
Right,
Yes,
yeah, right. The thing is, I think that the key in the beginning was that the Ukrainians had the chance to prepare for this upcoming conflict. And the Ukrainians always said the Russians will come again.
Yeah.
The West was not believing
Absolutely
it.
right. Yeah.
So what the good thing was in the beginning, first of all, it was the tactics, what the Ukrainians applied against the Russian forces. Then, of course, it was intelligence, which were
Western allies.
from the Western allies,
Yeah.
and then, of course, the weapon deliveries. But this helped especially the Ukrainians to gain time and to go into the offensive again. And that is what happened later then at Kherson and, of course, in Kharkiv. So at the moment, they have consolidated. I think the good thing with Bakhmut, for example, is that the Ukrainians were not using those reserves, these brigades for the offensive, to be more or less involved in the Bakhmut situation. Because whatever you think about Bakhmut at the moment, the good thing is that Ukraine still has these 12 brigades available, which they can use on their decision wherever it is necessary to attack the Russians at a certain place in a way that by using surprise, for example, they can maybe expect to have some kind of a breakthrough.
Markus, I have two more questions. One question, my second question actually, concerning what will be the next, what we can anticipate during the next 6 months or year. I know it's difficult to do some forecast because every day we have a new circumstances, like with Belgorod yesterday, and you have already commented it. Maybe you can mention something. So what do you think generally regarding the map that you see would be? Will be the wall frozen? Will be the floor frozen in the front line, or it happen some unpredictable things which can seriously shift the front line? What do you think?
The thing is, if you try to have some kind of a bird view on what was happening the last months, then I think we can both agree that whenever Ukraine was going into the offensive, whenever it became mobile, they were successful. And whenever the Russians were able to force the Ukrainians in a static war, they were successful. So just remember, so there was the success at Kiev, and then there was the success, of course, in Kharkiv and in Kherson. But there was also the problem with the cauldron battle of Siversky Donetsk and Lysychansk. Why was this won by the Russians with the breakthrough at Popasna? Because they forced the Ukrainian in a static warfare. So the Ukrainians had to break out to be in the offensive again. And the same situation we have at the moment, because the Ukrainians were successful doing the offensive at Kharkiv and Kherson, and then the Russians consolidated. They forced the Ukrainians into a static warfare, and by using the artillery, they are trying to retreat the Ukrainian forces. So this is why it is so important for the Ukrainians to become mobile again, because as long as you're not mobile, you just sit in your trenches and you have to face Russian artillery, Russian kamikaze drones, Russian electronic warfare, Russian gliding bombs, and all this kind of stuff. That means you have to break out. It's like in the First World War. In the First World War, there was always a stalemate in between the warring factions. And then when the tank was introduced into the battlefield, one side became mobile again, and that was the success model. So what I predict is that Ukraine tries or will try to become mobile again, to break out of these attritional battles which we see, or which we have seen in the last months.
So you think that the tactics of Ukrainians which were successful can be repeated in the future? And what would be the reaction of Russians? What they will do?
So first of all, I think, again, we have to distinguish between the tactical and operational level. So this is what is going on the front lines, and the strategic level. So there are two things Ukraine has to do, or will do. The first thing is what I explained on the tactical operational level. They have to break out of this war of attrition. And the other thing is on the strategic level, they have to make sure that the strategic air campaign of the Russians against especially the depths of Ukraine will stop. And this they have to do in two ways. First of all, more air defense, not only 2 batteries, but even more. And the second one is an air force, because you need an air force to defend the country against more or less the Russian
You mean F-16 and the other?
Right, all this kind of stuff. So there are these two things which they have to come up with. So Ukraine will try to make sure that both elements, the strategic level and the operational tactical, are fulfilled in a way. The Russians will, of course, try to adapt. But the thing is, with the forces they have, they can fight a good positional war, but I think when it comes to flexibility, the Russians are not this kind of flexible like the Ukrainians are. That means the Ukrainians need this factor of surprise and deception to make sure that, like they did in Kharkiv, there is a quick breakthrough, and then of course this breakthrough maybe can exploit it in a way that there is a huge gain in a certain area, like it is always discussed, maybe a breakthrough direction Mariupol, for example, to reach the Azov Sea, for example. So the Russians try to make sure that this will not happen. So when I say the Russians are adapting, that means they are trying to reinforce themselves, and whenever there is a possibility for them, they will try to have some small gains. But the question is, are they able also to come up with some kind of an operational level offensive? I think for the moment, no, because they still are lacking from the problem from the beginning that they don't have enough forces there. The question is the reservists. So let's start from the beginning. So the thing is, when you compare the size of the country to the amount of troops the Russians used, then you can see clearly there's a gap. So this 150,000 to 200,000, the number was too small. So what they did is, after the shock in the beginning, they tried to bring in more reinforcements, and this is what they did by using the reserve elements. But you always have to consider that after the contract service, by using them as a contractniki, they can bring in more soldiers. So what we know at the moment, and this is also stated by high-level American generals, that the Russians have about 350 to 400,000 troops around, and there might be the next wave coming in, and these are 120,000 contractniki, which will have a new contract, which maybe have a better moral than the reservists which are at the front line at the moment. So maybe these forces they can use, and this is something the Ukrainians also have to prepare for, that they maybe have to consider what will happen when the Russians are bringing these fresh reserves in a way.
Okay, it's a very you mentioned a lot of things, and it's very, very complicated to not agree with you. However, I'm very pleased that we did not use political analysis during the situation, but it's very, very complicated to analyze the current situation in Ukraine without regarding political things. But you are the military. That's why my last question concerning the military situation, not political also. I'm not a military expert, but I see the signs that this war in a year, or maybe this year or in 2 years, can reach other countries. So I think it's impossible to control this war. It's very difficult to localize this war only in Ukraine. Do you see from the military point of view that due to the geopolitical or regional deterioration of situation, this war can be more bigger?
I think it has already spread out. I will give you just one example. And I will not talk about all the assets which the Russians can apply by using hybrid warfare. But just take Wagner, for example. We always focus on what is Wagner doing at the moment in Bakhmut, for example. But Wagner also has a global role. So, as you know, there is this very famous game, Risiko. And I guess you know that the game Risiko is about placing little soldier figures on certain places all over the world. So while we are looking into Ukraine, a lot of it is going on in other places of the world. Let's look to Africa, for example. So the French have withdrawn their troops from Mali. The Russians, by using Wagner, are present in Mali, in Burkina Faso, in Libya. So they try to control the Sahel. When they try to control the Sahel, that means they have a clear understanding. Why? Because if they are able to control the Sahel, they might control also migration, for example. And this will have an effect on Europe. So I think it's spread out already. You also have to look at what happened in Sudan, for example, also quite interesting.
Or earlier in Syria.
So yeah, so like we have seen in the last Cold War,
Mm-hmm.
where there were a lot of little wars going on between the warring factions in different countries. I think this has started already again. And of course, you also have to think about the economical war, because there is an economical war going on. And the question is, and I think that Russia on its own cannot win the war, but the question is, what is the fact if you consider that Russia, together with China, for example, with India, or with regional powers like Turkey or Iran in connection, so that the global south, that is always said, fight against the global north. And so there are some signs which I think give us a clear understanding also from the military perspective that this regional conflict has a greater impact all over the global situation.
I took the interview with Gerhard Mangot,
Yeah.
and he said one thing during his interview, that Austria and European Union, but Austria should think about new, maybe, reality of the situation. So do you think that this war can change the future map? Not, I mean, in the territorial, but the security map of European Union, maybe, and the NATO. I mean, and even of your country. Do you think that this war can force to rethink reality? That it's very difficult now to live in the world with using old-fashioned things.
I would say it has already started, because Finland is part of NATO. Sweden Sweden is still not accepted, but still wants to go into NATO. A lot of nations, even the neutral ones, are discussing the security compass, more or less, in a way. So things have already changed. And the thing is, when you look into history, and again try to understand what happened in all these centuries before, then there is one common thing, and this is that things are not happening very fast in a way. If societies are, let's say, in a way, think that security is assured and is, let's say, something which is granted, it will take some time for them until they understand how serious the situation is, and this is not for granted, and then they have to come up with solutions on that. But the thing is, they have to be affected. As long as there is no one who is affected, they will not change, because they say, well, it don't bother us. So it's something there in Ukraine. What the hell, we don't have to do. But so you really have to be affected, and then things are changing in a way.
Okay, Markus, thanks for your interview. Thanks for your time. I think we will meet in future and make one more interview.
Okay, all the best.
For your
All the best, Andrei. Take care.